In the spring of 2012, police in the small desert town of Nacozari de García, Sonora, stumbled upon a scene that would haunt even the most seasoned investigators. What they found was not a typical crime scene, but an altar, a shrine decorated with candles, skeletal statues, offerings of tequila and cigarettes, and 3 shallow graves nearby. It was here that a small cult devoted to Santa Muerte, Saint Death, had performed ritual killings. The victims, all locals, had been lured to this place under the promise of prosperity and healing. Instead, they became sacrifices. This story barely made headlines in the United States. Overshadowed by cartel violence and political turmoil, the ritual killings of Sonora quickly faded into the background noise of borderland crime. But when you look closer, this case reveals something deeper about faith, desperation, and the blurred line between devotion and darkness. Today, we revisit one of the most forgotten ritual killings in North America, the Santa Muerte murders of 2012. To understand what happened in Sonora, we have to first understand who Santa Muerte is and how she became both a symbol of comfort and fear. Santa Muerte, or Saint Death, is not an official Catholic saint. She's a folk figure, the personification of death itself, often depicted as a skeletal woman in robes, holding a globe and a scythe. Her origins trace back hundreds of years, a fusion of Spanish colonial Catholicism and indigenous death deities. For many Mexicans and Mexican Americans, she represents something very personal, a protector of the forgotten, the poor, and those living on the edge of society. Migrants, criminals, sex workers, and the devout poor alike pray to her for safety, love, and good fortune. But in 2012, her image was splashed across newspapers for a different reason. The cult in Sonora, led by a self-proclaimed priestess, had turned their worship into something else, something lethal. To understand how the Santa Muerte cult in Sonora transformed from private worship to ritual murder, we have to step inside the world Silvia Meraz created. Silvia lived on the outskirts of Nacozari de García in a modest, 2-room home. The yard was surrounded by rusted wire fencing, the earth packed hard and dry beneath the desert sun. There, in the center, stood a homemade altar, a wooden table draped with cloth and covered in trinkets. Coins, plastic flowers, photographs, and a large statue of Santa Muerte cloaked in red. The red robe was important. Devotees believe each color represents a different aspect of Santa Muerte's power. White for purity, gold for prosperity, red for love and passion, but also blood, vengeance, and sacrifice. Over time, Silvia became convinced that her connection with the saint was special, chosen, even. She began calling herself La Madrina, the godmother. To her followers, that meant authority. To her victims, it meant death. Silvia's family circle included 7 members, her son Ramon, her daughter Maria, and 5 grandchildren. All of them, authorities later discovered, took part in the ceremonies. They were not wealthy, not educated. Life in Nacozari was hard. Jobs in the copper mine came and went, and the family survived on small trading and government aid. In that environment, Silvia's promises of divine protection and eternal reward carried weight. Neighbors recalled seeing the family gather late at night, burning candles, murmuring prayers, and chanting praises to Santa Muerte. Some assumed it was just fervent devotion. Others felt something darker. One woman later told reporters, "You could hear screams sometimes. Not terrified screams, but like chanting mixed with crying. We thought they were possessed." According to court documents and police testimony, the first human victim was Martin Rios, a 10-year-old boy who was related to one of Silvia's followers. Silvia allegedly told the group that the child's blood would please the saint, that offering him would bring protection and wealth. On the night of March 1, 2012, Martin was led to the altar under the pretense of a family gathering. There, the group surrounded him. Silvia performed the blessing, while her grandson held a knife. They prayed, then drew blood from the boy's neck and chest. His body was buried behind the house. It's almost impossible to process this kind of horror. Yet, in Silvia's mind, this was not murder. She told investigators that Santa Muerte asked for a soul, and she was only obeying. After the first killing, Silvia's group reportedly experienced what they believed were signs of blessing. They found a lost wallet full of money, received food donations, and avoided police attention despite neighborhood suspicions. To them, it confirmed the ritual had worked. Weeks later, Silvia claimed the saint had appeared in a dream, demanding 2 more sacrifices. The next victims would be a 55-year-old woman named Cleotilde Romero and a man in his 30s who lived nearby. Both were invited to Silvia's home for spiritual cleansing ceremonies. Both would never leave alive. Each time, the ritual followed the same pattern. Prayers, chanting, an incision made to let the blood flow into a container, and the burial at dawn. It's chilling to realize that this wasn't done in secret basements or remote forests, but in a residential area, within earshot of neighbors, children, and church bells. When police finally discovered the bodies, they were found only a few meters apart. Each grave contained objects of devotion: crosses, rosaries, coins, and colored candles. Silvia and her followers had poured animal blood and tequila over the graves as part of the ritual's closing. The forensic report later revealed that the victims had died from exsanguination, blood loss, confirming the ritual nature of their deaths. After their arrest, Silvia remained defiant. In court she declared, "Santa Muerte asked for this. It was her will." Her followers, including her own children, echoed her words almost word for word. It was as if reason itself had been erased by devotion. Psychologists who reviewed the case described it as collective psychosis within a closed religious system. Others called it simply manipulation, a charismatic leader exploiting the desperate. But for investigators, it was something more haunting. Proof that faith, when distorted, could override morality entirely. The story might have ended there, confined to Mexican news outlets and dusty police files. But for criminologists and anthropologists, the Sonora murders became a disturbing case study. They saw in it the convergence of social collapse, magical thinking, and inherited trauma. In many ways, this was not just the story of a cult. It was the story of communities abandoned by institutions, where divine intermediaries fill the vacuum left by poverty and fear. While major U.S. outlets mentioned the case only briefly, Mexican journalists and scholars saw it as a warning. Devotion to Santa Muerte was rising rapidly, millions of followers across Mexico, the U.S., and Central America. The vast majority peaceful. But this small, deranged cell in Sonora had painted the saint in blood. And so, for a time, police raids targeted shrines and devotees across northern Mexico, deepening mistrust and pushing the faith further underground. What few remember is that this overreaction had consequences, not just for the believers but for law enforcement itself. Because the Sonora case would soon cross the border, indirectly inspiring panic in Arizona and Texas, where authorities began seeing Santa Muerte symbols in cartel crimes. But the truth is simpler and sadder. Silvia Meraz Moreno and her family were not cartel operatives. They weren't smugglers or Satanists. They were poor, frightened people who believed death could listen. In a world where they felt invisible, Santa Muerte offered them visibility. And that visibility in the wrong hands turned fatal. By the time the last victim was buried, whispers had already started spreading through Nacozari. Children were warned not to go near Silvia Meraz's house. Locals said they saw flickering lights in her yard at night. Others heard drumming, or what sounded like chanting. The fear was real, but the police didn't act immediately. Small-town departments in Sonora had little experience with ritual crimes. When people went missing, most assumed they had fled to seek work across the border. That changed when Martin Rios, the 10-year-old boy, disappeared. His grandmother filed a report, insisting he'd been with relatives at Silvia's house before vanishing. For a week, officers searched the area, abandoned wells, mine shafts, and dry riverbeds. Then, following a tip from a frightened cult member, they arrived at Silvia's home. What they found there would make national news. The search began cautiously. Officers entered the yard, where an altar stood in the open, decorated with Santa Muerte statues, dried flowers, melted candles, and traces of dried blood. Behind the house, a small patch of freshly turned soil caught their attention. They began digging. Within minutes, the shovel hit something soft. A child's blanket. Beneath it, the first body. The police sealed off the area, and by the end of the day, they uncovered 3 graves, each with offerings and ritual symbols. When questioned, Silvia denied everything. But one of her followers, reportedly a teenage girl, broke down and confessed that the boy's death had been a sacrifice for Santa Muerte. The statement changed the course of the investigation overnight. As police searched Silvia's house, they found notebooks filled with prayers and instructions, written in her handwriting, describing the steps of a ritual she called El Pacto de Sangre, the blood pact. One chilling line read, "To be seen by holy death, the blood must flow freely. The heart must be offered warm." This discovery solidified the ritualistic motive, but it also created a cultural firestorm. Santa Muerte, for millions, was a symbol of hope. Now, newspapers were calling her the saint of death worshippers. Churches denounced the faith. Politicians demanded crackdowns on shrines. The truth, as always, was more complicated, but nuance doesn't sell headlines. Silvia and 7 family members were arrested within 48 hours. Their ages ranged from 10 to 55. Even the youngest, a child, had allegedly helped during the rituals. At the police station, investigators faced an unexpected challenge. The suspects didn't appear frightened. They prayed out loud. They thanked Santa Muerte for their capture, claiming it was part of the plan. One officer later told reporters, "They smiled during questioning. They thought they were protected." When prosecutors asked Silvia why she'd killed, she said calmly, "We didn't kill. We offered." For investigators, this was uncharted territory. Mexico had seen plenty of murders tied to narco-cults and pseudo-religious rituals, but this case was different. There was no money, no drugs, no power struggle. Just belief. The state prosecutor, Jesus Alberto Salazar, called it a tragedy of ignorance and fear. He told the media, they believed they were doing good, that death would protect them. But beneath that belief was deep psychological manipulation. Experts who later analyzed Silvia's behavior concluded she displayed traits of narcissistic delusion, convinced of her divine selection, unable to separate faith from fantasy. Her children, raised under her influence, saw obedience as salvation. The media dubbed the group El Culto de la Muerte de Nacozari, the death cult of Nacozari. For weeks, TV crews from Hermosillo and Mexico City camped outside the town. But coverage quickly faded as new violence erupted elsewhere. In the U.S., the story barely registered. A few regional papers in Arizona and Texas ran short articles, most referring to the group simply as satanic. The nuance of Santa Muerte devotion was lost in translation. Even today, few Americans know this case ever happened, despite it being one of the most verifiable instances of modern ritual sacrifice on the continent. Back in Sonora, the investigation concluded in late 2013. Silvia Meraz Moreno and 6 relatives were convicted of 3 counts of murder and criminal association. Because Mexico had abolished the death penalty decades earlier, Silvia was sentenced to 60 years in prison, the maximum possible term. Her children received reduced sentences for cooperation. When reporters visited Silvia in prison months later, she was unrepentant. She told one journalist, "Santa Muerte will free me when the time is right." To this day, she remains behind bars, still praying to the saint she claimed demanded blood. After the trial, investigators were left with more questions than answers. How could an entire family participate in murder? How does devotion turn into delusion? Psychologists called it ritual reinforcement. Each killing, they explained, deepened the belief system, proving to the group that their faith was real because they were willing to die or kill for it. It's a pattern seen in cults worldwide, from Jonestown to small-town sects in Latin America. But in Sonora, the added layer of folk religion made it harder to untangle where worship ended and madness began. Over time, the case was quietly filed away. The graves were sealed, the altar dismantled, and the yard turned to dust again. But for locals, the fear lingered. Children crossed the street to avoid the house. Elders whispered prayers when passing the site. Even now, 13 years later, those who lived through it say the land feels cursed. One woman told El Impartial newspaper in 2020, "We hear footsteps some nights. The dead are still walking. Whether superstition or trauma, the pain of those crimes still echoes in the Sonoran desert." Yet what makes this story so haunting isn't just the horror of the acts. It's how easily they were forgotten. Ritual killings on American soil are rare. Documented cases even rarer. And yet this one, just a few miles south of the border, vanished from the collective memory almost overnight. Perhaps because it doesn't fit neatly into any narrative. Not cartel violence, not organized religion, not madness alone. It was something in between. After the 2012 Santa Muerte ritual killings in Sonora, life in Nacozari de García slowly returned to routine, at least on the surface. The mine reopened, schools filled again, and the crime scene was sealed off and forgotten by most. But underneath that quiet, something had changed. The murders had left behind not only grief, but stigma, a shadow cast over a faith that millions hold sacred. To this day, locals say the word Santa Muerte with hesitation, not because they stopped believing, but because they don't want to be mistaken for murderers. The cult led by Silvia Meraz Moreno was an aberration, a violent mutation of devotion born from poverty, ignorance, and fear. But for many outsiders, it came to define Santa Muerte worship entirely. In the aftermath of the killings, Mexican authorities began cracking down on shrines dedicated to Santa Muerte, not because of proven danger, but because of the fear the cult had unleashed. Police in several states bulldozed roadside altars, declaring them symbols of criminality. Churches publicly denounced Santa Muerte as a false saint. But for every altar destroyed, 2 more appeared, in homes on corners in border towns and in the United States. Within 5 years, statues of Santa Muerte were being sold openly in Los Angeles, Tucson, and Houston. Her image spread through murals, tattoos, and prayer cards. To anthropologists, this wasn't surprising. Faith, especially one rooted in folk tradition, doesn't die under pressure, it adapts. What's often misunderstood is that Santa Muerte devotion, in its true form, has little to do with violence. Most followers see her as a guardian, a non-judgmental figure who accepts everyone, including those rejected by the church or society. For migrants, she's the protector on dangerous journeys. For prisoners, the listener when no one else cares. For the poor, a symbol of dignity in death. But for a few, like Sylvia, the desperation to feel chosen, to be seen by something divine, can twist that devotion into tragedy. Criminologists now cite the Sonora murders as one of the clearest examples of ritualized homicide in modern North America, distinct from satanic panic myths or drug-related killings. Yet the U.S. media barely mentions it. Search for the case, and you'll find only a handful of brief articles and archived Spanish-language reports. No documentaries. No podcast. Almost as if the story was too inconvenient, too complex to fit into the usual narrative. It's easier to imagine ritual killings as something ancient, Aztec altars, medieval witch trials, not something from just over a decade ago, in a border town we could drive to in half a day. The irony is that Santa Muerte herself, the saint of death, has become a symbol of life for millions. Shrines bloom in poor neighborhoods like small gardens of faith. Offerings of food, cigarettes, flowers, and prayers fill the air with scent and hope. For the living, she's not a call to kill, but a reminder that everyone, no matter how forgotten, will be remembered by death, that in the end, equality is inevitable. In Nacozari, the house where the murders occurred was eventually torn down. Today, a patch of empty desert remains where it once stood. But locals say the place still carries a silence that feels heavy, as if the earth remembers. A small wooden cross now stands there. No name, no inscription, just a reminder of what was lost when belief turned into blindness. When we look back on the Sonora killings, it's tempting to label them as evil. And yes, the acts themselves were horrific. There's no denying that. But what's more unsettling is how ordinary the people behind them were. They weren't monsters. They were parents, children, neighbors, drawn into a cycle of belief that promised control in a world that offered them none. That's what makes this story so difficult and so important to remember. Every culture has its myths, stories that warn what happens when faith becomes fanaticism. In Mexico, that story might just be the tragedy of Silvia Meraz and her family, the cult who mistook devotion for destiny and sacrifice for salvation. And yet, amid the horror, there's a deeper lesson. That belief, when starved of compassion and truth, can consume itself. More than a decade later, Santa Muerte's image still stands on altars from Mexico City to Los Angeles. She's still prayed to by mothers, workers, migrants, and yes, even by prisoners. Her cult, if it can be called that, is one of paradoxes. Feared and loved, condemned and worshipped, blamed and defended. The Sonora murders did not define her. They revealed how fragile faith can become when desperation replaces understanding. When you walk through the borderlands today, you can still see small shrines glowing along the roads. Truckers honk as they pass. Migrants whisper a prayer for safety. Locals leave coins or cigarettes, not out of fear, but respect. To them, Santa Muerte is not a call to die, but a promise that death itself will not forget them. And perhaps that's why her cult endures, because in a world where so many are unseen, she sees everyone. The story of the Santa Muerte killings of Sonora isn't just about death. It's about the forgotten people who live in its shadow. It's about how, even in the darkest corners of faith, there are lessons worth remembering. Because when faith turns to fear and belief to blood, the line between salvation and damnation disappears. And the most frightening part? It didn't happen centuries ago. It happened in our time, in a small town just beyond the border, where the desert remembers everything.